I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight TV, we're shining a light on the often unseen and unheard stories of the homeless through the eyes of Dr. Muriel Ryan, author of a remarkable book. It is called Homeless I Have Known. In it, Dr. Ryan, alongside her husband Bernard, embarked on a mission to understand and aid the homeless, transforming their insights into a powerful narrative that challenges perceptions and uncovers the multifaceted nature of homelessness. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank our team at Bookside Press for helping us put her in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like her by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing her remarkable book. The links are below this interview. Dr. Ryan, great to see you here today on Spotlight.
I'm delighted to be here, and I'm thankful that you've given us such an opportunity to share the words and the concerns about those persons without shelter.
Absolutely. It is a huge concern. And I noticed right off the bat, you referred to what many people call homeless as persons without shelter, which is a much more compassionate term. And I will try to use that as much today as possible during the interview. And you make a note of that in your book as well. And I think that's a great point that you make. It's estimated that there are between anywhere from 250,000 to 3 million people without shelter in this country. It's just a mind-boggling number. And when you go into the city streets of any major city, you'll see that the streets are littered, quite literally, with people without shelter. So it's a huge problem. So what you and your husband embarked upon to create an understanding of the problem and an understanding of the people, I think was remarkable. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
To be quite honest, I don't think either one of us knew what kind of journey we were going on.
Mm.
There were a lot of things to learn, and I did this in my hometown, Terre Haute, Indiana. And the short story is Terre Haute is no different than most suburban, urban cities that have found themselves with a sizable number of homeless. But just even after 10 years, I feel like I just barely scratched the surface of understanding.
Mm.
Um, many people, um, unfortunately, find themselves in situations where they have worked with folks that are without shelter and, quite frankly, still carry across a subset of thinking them as addicts of some sort, or um, lazy, or not motivated. The list goes on and on. But I found it to be much more complicated, and so did my husband at that time.
Right, because it's easy to, paint them with a broad brush and say they're all drug addicts, they're all schizophrenics, they're all mentally ill, they don't want to be helped. And there is, like you said, a subsection of the homeless that have that problem, that they're, paranoid from mental illness perhaps and don't want to be in a shelter and housing or so forth. And it's their choice to be on the street, even on freezing nights sometimes. But there are a bunch of people, like some of the folks you document in your book. Like I believe the first woman you talk about is Nancy and her daughter or son that you simply refer to as the child, who the mother lost her job through no fault of her own. She had a heart condition and she was weak and she was not able to work. And you were able to help her. Tell us a little bit about that first story of that family that you document in your book.
Well, I keep thinking about that family because, number one, they were the first family,
Mhm.
again, as well as the fact that not having worked with the homeless, this was my total introduction with this lady.
Mhm.
Very kind, a very gentle woman. She had been in a long-term facility, and we were considering ourselves transitional, which is a longer term preparing you for permanent housing. She moved in January, and by the last week of May, she had a massive stroke.
Mhm.
And within 12 hours, we knew that we needed to find child's sibling
Mhm.
that we could end up placing her with someone that was familial, and not having her placed in foster care or something on that like, or persons that would be totally unknown to us. And I think when you read that chapter and find out how we found that sibling, it's just short of a miracle that we
Mm,
did it in less than 6 hours. Um, but the circumstances continue to astound me because this child, who happened to be a young lady, is now grown, is now a mother herself of one
mm,
under the year old. And it's a blessing to stay in contact with so many of the children that we served because our first shelter was open to mothers with children.
mm,
And that was called Deborah's House. Deborah is a judge, the only female judge in the Old Testament. And because of that circumstance and watching the women have to take leadership within the household, that's where we got the name Deborah come from.
mm.
And the other thing too is this isn't much a lesson about that family, but also a lesson to those who are believers in God
Mm,
and haven't pieced together. There's a certain amount of things we're supposed to be doing:
mm.
feeding the hungry, bringing the stranger in, clothing the naked, um, visiting those in prison, visiting those that are sick. So there's as much faith built into Homeless I've Known as there is story after story.
It's remarkable the profound impact you had on many lives by simply being compassionate to Nancy and her child, because now that child is an adult, has a family of her own, and that child will have a family and so on and so forth as the circle of life goes. And so you've had a lasting impact that'll, have a profound effect for generations because you did what Christ would want you to do. You
It
followed
made
the
sense to me.
Beatitudes.
It made sense to me all over.
Yeah.
Is that is our direction, our purpose, and thank you for being so verbal and very supportive of that particular um, faith-based direction.
Yeah. I mean, whether you believe Jesus is the Son of God, or whether you believe Jesus is a prophet, or whether you believe Jesus is just a good man, I mean, his teachings are profound
Amen.
and they're indisputable that we are here to
Correct.
help each other and live for each other, and self-sacrifice. So I think it's wonderful what you've done. And that's just one story of the many
Right.
lives that you touched during your post-retirement era of your life, which I think was profound as well. And a big part of this, of course, was your husband, Bernard, who unfortunately has left us now about a year ago. And you're setting up a scholarship or hope to set up a scholarship in his honor, in his name, and in the line of work that he was pursuing. Tell us a little bit about that.
It would be named the Ryan Scholarship Fund for research into the homeless. And we're looking for more data that would help us be a lot more sure of what we perceive. My husband and I had both completed our doctoral degrees. He at Harvard, myself at University of Minnesota in school administration. And of course, schools have contact, but unfortunately, we don't always know we're in contact with a homeless child, a family that is without shelter. Um, Case in point, though there's federal money coming down, I have not found a state yet that would not remove a child when they discover that the child is not in permanent housing
Hmm.
or stable housing. So that right off the bat, for both of us, we were uncomfortable with it as a policy, largely because knowing that would make a difference. And I was constantly amazed with the number of mothers and children that we would register for school, that was never a question they were asked. They were asked what their address was, and they would provide the shelter address, of course. But on the other hand, no one would know until maybe 18 months, a year later, that they were actually in a shelter
Hmm.
circumstance. Um, once they get into a shelter, they're not considered putting the child at risk, but at the same time, not allowing the teachers that work with this child to understand that the child had been in the third school for the in 1 year, that would have an impact on them, which most certainly it would. It's difficult, and that's one area of research that needs to be done. The long-term impact of children being without shelter. What about them in terms of how do they establish friendships? How do they feel like they're being consistent in their academic progress? What kind of circumstances allow for changes that are so disruptive to their social development and their social skills? What kind of changes are services offered to them when they are received into a new school?
Mm.
Well, the parents just would rather not tell the world that they are in a homeless shelter or have been homeless for perhaps anywhere from 6 to 8 months.
Yeah. And with good reason, as you said, they're at risk of being separated from their children if those children or the parent were disclosed that they're in a shelter rather than living in a home. We live in an era now that began after 2020 where our cities are filled with empty buildings. Is this not a great opportunity to retrofit those zombie buildings that they're called and make them housing for people who need affordable homes, people without shelter? What's your thought?
It's interesting you should end up bringing this up because I've had the blessing and privilege of living in Minnesota, New Jersey, Virginia, now South Carolina, Indiana. And you're right, there are buildings all over the place. They have been for a long time now
Hmm.
that um, seem to be very logically set up uh, to end up putting people in them,
Hmm.
offer them services for them. Um, I presently here in South Carolina do work with an organization called Pathways that works for both women that are homeless and men that are homeless, veterans. And the thing that is absolutely ironic is that it's actually a converted old elementary school. And
There
I
you go.
recognized it immediately. I said, I've seen a building or two like that before. Um, and yes, part of it has to do with funds. It's tough to get the funds to do restoration. There are certain valid
Right.
regulations having to do with creating fire safety.
But we're
Um,
about to send $100 billion overseas.
yes,
$100 billion. And that's just the latest check that we're sending. I mean, we address other problems of people who are displaced, of people who are hurting, of people who are in need, and that's admirable. But, our circle of concern, just like a family, sometimes has to be first the family, then the community, then the city, then the county, then the nation. Uh, I think we have a moral obligation to take care of the folks who are here, and nobody talks about it. They talk about building a wall to keep the immigrants out. They talk about, I don't even know what the promises are during this election cycle because I've heard them all before and I've heard them for decades and nothing ever gets done. But I think what's remarkable and what's the point of your book is that we don't necessarily have to wait on government. We don't even necessarily have to wait on church. What we have to do is be concerned individuals, a woman who gets together with her husband and said, let's take a journey. Let's find out what this is all about. Let's see what we can shine a light on. And you've done that. We're almost out of time, but I'd like to give you the final word, Dr. Ryan.
I just want to mention the fact that become familiar, find out what you can do, find out whether or not the shelter needs extra sheets. If you're in the situation where I just recently moved again, and the short story is that a lot of stuff got redistributed. I went through my closet. If I haven't worn it in a year, it's time for it to move on. Um, how about I bought 75 cans of soup and I only ended up consuming 60.
Mm,
15 of those need to go to her for a lunch or dinner for a hot plate.
yeah.
The other thing, too, is become very aware of seasonal crisis. Um, there are persons that will recognize that they need to be fed. Yes, they need to be fed. But those that are in shelters that are serving them need to remember that we have extremes here in the United States and everywhere around the globe. A person is more likely to succumb to heat stroke or hypothermia than they will die of hunger or malnutrition. And it's those extremes. So if you want to come forth, deliver a whole lot of bottles of cold water, fans to the nearest shelter, get involved, find out, meet them. They're people like your brothers and sisters, like your aunts and uncles, like the children that you love.
Amen. Beautifully said. And we started out this program by saying there is a subsection that are mentally ill and are drug addicted, but those people need treatment and care too. I mean, that's
Right.
another thing we're not addressing. We're not addressing mental illness in this country, and unprecedented violence is the result. We're not addressing drug addiction in this country, and unprecedented death and destruction is the result. People have to start caring, and the change can begin with you, just like it
Amen.
did with you. Wonderful, Dr. Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Take care.
The name of Dr. Ryan's book is Homeless, I Have Known. A song alongside her husband, Bernard, they embarked upon a journey, a mission to understand and aid the homeless. Their insights have now been transformed into a powerful narrative that will help you better understand the people who are living on our streets without shelter. Until next time, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.